Thank you, Ee-Seul. Thank you to everyone for coming. I know the talk was advertised on a bit of a different paper. That's a paper I have forthcoming in Environment and Planning A, and that I'm happy to share with everyone if my email address is on the slide in front of you. So that paper looks at how markets are created and looking at the local politics of markets creation in the United States. But after talking with Ee-Seul, and as she mentioned, we thought it might be more useful for myself and for others if we talked about the direction that my dissertation research is going. And I'll be defending my proposal next week, and I'm very interested in hearing about what people think about my project and whether it's useful for people thinking about market making in education. As Ee-Seul mentioned, my background isn't in education studies, and this is actually a relatively new field to me. My background is in geography and urban planning, and what I'm most interested in is how political and economic shifts result in changes to the institutions that affect people's everyday lives. And I think this perspective coming from political economy to education, rather from education to political economy, might be something interesting that we can talk about in relation to the other discussions we've been having in this seminar series. So in using this perspective, one of the question I really want to interrogate today is, what happens when we take markets in education seriously as markets in the way that economists talk about them? And I would suggest a lot of the way we talk about marketization in education actually doesn't really interrogate the term market itself, either taking it as for granted as the way neoclassical economists talk about it, or referring to them as quasi-markets, which are different than the markets economists talk about them, because this is a more state-regulated area than the traditional markets we think of. And if there's one thing I want to do today is unpack what we mean when we talk about markets and draw upon different scholarship of markets, specifically the sociology of markets, to think about marketization in education. And in order to do that, I'm going to discuss three main questions. How can we understand markets? And here I'll draw in the sociology of markets. What does this mean for education? Does this understanding change how we view markets emerging in education? And then I'm hoping we can have a discussion about whether this is useful, does this affect our scholarship, and I'll end with some thoughts on that. So what do we mean when we talk about a market? It's funny, but for such a central term in the way our economy and our society indeed run, it's not a term that we spend a lot of time interrogating. The way markets are commonly discussed is less about markets as a plural thing and more about the market as this homogenizing force, where the type of commodity being sold and the society it takes place within are almost irrelevant. So in this understanding of markets, a fruit market and a stock market may trade different things. The culture around them may be completely different, but we're told that both are made up of rational actors who are seeking to maximize their value, and we can understand the way they function as broadly similar with some variations. However, there's also a strain of research in other disciplines which has sought to actually look at markets as they exist in the world and use that to understand how markets function as social institutions. So people have studied fruit markets in France, they've studied derivative markets in Chicago, logging markets in Indonesia, and sought to look at how they're structured and how they change as the actors within them change. And the key divergence here is that we can't understand markets as something outside of society, but instead as something that is enveloped or embedded within the broader societal forces that structure the way markets function. And most crucially of all, that markets as social institutions change over time as they're struggled through and with by actors. And this quote that I'm bringing up from Neil Fligstein, who's one of the authors of this approach, suggests it's insufficient to say that markets are any one thing, that they're efficient ways of distributing resources, that they respond to the needs of consumers or the decisions of consumers, because whether or not markets function this way are actually going to depend greatly on how actual markets, specific markets, exist, how they're contested by different actors, and how they evolve. And this is because markets are actually structured institutions in a variety of ways. Most common when we think about this, people talk about state regulation as something that affects markets, and to neoclassical economists, they actually distort the way markets function because they believe markets should function in a particular way. But understanding through the sociology of markets is that while the state does play a large role in structuring many markets, there are also other social relations that exist within markets that structure how they work and how they form. And this, you can see this at the level of almost any market. So if you take a newspaper vendor selling newspapers on the side of the street informally, there are all these unwritten rules of how that market will work. Who's allowed to set up their booth where? What type of haggling is acceptable? What type of products can you sell? How are police going to react to you if you're selling at different times or in different ways? And these type of informal and formal rules of markets exist within all markets. And I'll give you one more specific example. Commodity markets are something we would think of as quite natural. So if you think of a commodity such as cotton, the way it actually works as a market isn't that there's a clothing manufacturer who walks into a giant market where people are selling cotton, feels the cotton in their hands, negotiate with different vendors, but it's actually something that's actually is quite structured in that the market for cotton is actually a market for multiple different grades of cotton that is measured according to its color, the length of its fiber, the trash content of that cotton. And these ways of grading cotton aren't actually neutral ways of structuring a market, and they didn't arise through thin air. But what they do is they structure markets in certain ways. So certain gradings of cottons will allow certain areas that produce cottons to thrive more where others will not. And they emerged over years and years of contestation between different cotton interests. So cotton grading there were multiple ways of grading cotton in the 1800s, where merchants in Liverpool and merchants in the American South were struggling to control how the market evolved through controlling how we traded from our cotton and how it was graded. And it wasn't until after World War I, when the geopolitical balance of power shifted, that Americans were actually able to enforce their way of measuring cotton and thus structure the market in a way that works their way. So therefore, even in these almost natural markets and commodities, we see the way that markets are actually structured and emerge over time between contests of actors with specific interests. And what I want to emphasize here is that it's important to understand markets not as natural systems that operate in a predetermined manner, but as rather contingent institutions that are made up of different actors who will attempt to struggle in ways to shape that market in various ways. They may choose to work together, they may fight over how a particular market is structured, or how commodities in that marketplace are judged. And these struggles are not just happening within markets, but are actually connected to broader struggles and societal forces that exist within our society. So within the cotton example, what happened within the market could not be understood without understanding the geopolitical shift after World War I that allowed America to put in place its understanding of how cotton should be graded in a way that would advantage their merchants and their producers. So we can't just examine processes that happen within markets as apart from the broader changes that we're seeing within society as a whole. And this is also true of important dynamics of difference, such as gender, race. If you think about how labor markets work, the feminization of certain industries, the gendered politics of work allow for certain people to be paid less, and that's going to structure how markets in areas like care or nursing evolve as opposed to other areas of the economy. So we have to think about all these different things as related to markets as when markets are evolving. And with this in mind, I think we need to conceptualize markets in areas like education as social institutions that aren't going to operate in any specific way across a place as diverse as the US or within different countries, because these aren't social institutions that can be easily read off from afar or strictly typologized, but instead institutions that emerge over time through contestation and struggle between actors who actually bring vastly different amounts of power to struggles within markets. And so we have to really pay attention to how markets change as they interact with different politics and as they articulate with different political cultures and cultural institutions, especially in an area like education, where many scholars have talked about it being relatively autonomous from the needs of capital. So in a place like education, we're going to see strong contestation of market logics, So in order to understand how marketization is happening in this field, we really have to think about it as a contingent, geographically variegated institution. So I spoke a little bit about education, but you might be asking the question, let's focus a bit more on education rather than this abstract discussion of markets. Well, I think this is important, especially now, to talk about education, because the justification for market systems, especially in a place like the United States, is strongly linked with market ideologies. If you go back to the work of Milton Friedman and Chubb and Moe, when they're talking about education and markets, they believe that markets respond to the needs of consumers, and therefore markets in education are going to be highly efficient institutions. If you have a different approach to studying markets in education that views the way they're structured as contingent, you're going to view this process as very differently. But in terms of the everyday politics of education, also the way markets are talked about in the politics of education allow for them to roll out in particular ways. This quote from Patricia Birch, who wrote a book called Hidden Markets, illustrates this. For market ideologists, the reason markets in education fail is not because there's a problem with market ideology, but because education markets don't act enough like the natural idealized markets that are put forward. So by disrupting this type of understanding of markets, there might be different type of interventions that we are able to make. And I also think for people who are resistant to the idea of markets in education, the type of scholarship we can do, the type of political interventions we might think about can also be shaped by thinking about how markets are shaped by their contestation. So what type of contestation is able to disarm the more damaging effect of markets that we think about when we think about markets in education. So therefore, when talking about schooling markets, I'm interested in looking at how markets in education are structured, how they're evaluated, how they change over time as actors struggle about them, and also how they relate to the particular politics in places. And I think through asking these questions, we can better understand how markets in schooling are likely to change institutions of public education, and how different type of contestations are likely to change how they're evolving. Before I delve into that, Ee-Seul thought it would be important to talk a little bit about the United States, which is where I'm actually going to be drawing my examples from. Like in Canada, schools in the United States are mostly administered by school districts that operate at the mostly local level. This isn't everywhere. Hawaii has a statewide school district. And again, like Canada, these districts are mostly the creature of the middle tier of government, the state level of government. So 90% of funding for schooling in the United States comes from either local or state administrations. But what we have seen recently, going back to No Child Left Behind and even before then, is that the federal government has played an increasing role in shaping how education in the United States is evolving through leveraging the amount of funding they have to enact specific policy changes. Most recently, President Obama's Race to the Top program has created a competition for funding where states apply to compete for federal funding, and that competition asks states to put in place mandates that are going to lead to more markets emerging in schooling through putting in place things like lifting the cap on charter schools as a way of increasing the amount of markets in education. So there's a complex scalar politics here where local, state, and federal institutions of schooling are all struggling over how markets in education are emerging. And how I want to start to talk about this, I'm going to look at this at three different scales: national, state, and municipal level. But I want to start with talking about the national regime of standardized curriculum and assessment that's emerging in the United States. As the Michael Apple quote on the slide illustrates, I don't think we can understand standardized curriculum and testing as separate from markets, because one of the things that sociologists of markets talk a lot about is the value problem of markets. So how do actors within markets understand and attach value to whatever that is being traded and what's being sold? And in cotton, we saw a fierce contestation over how cotton was being sold. And I would argue as markets are emerging in education, there's also a contestation about how we can put a value on pedagogical practice that will allow people to choose what school their children should attend, and allow investors to see what type of schooling should I be investing in, what's going to get the best results. And as with the struggle over Khan standards, this is something that is actively being fought over in the United States right now. We can see this through the fight over the Common Core State Standards. That is a national level curriculum that the federal government is pushing that several states have now opted out of recently. And so I want to talk a little bit about the ways that standardized testing will actually help structure markets that are emerging in education. So currently, variations in curriculum, standards of teaching from state to state actually result in a kind of fragmented market system around the United States, where you have 50 different states and each state has their own legislation. So if you're a national level charter school program, if you're providing curriculum development across the United States, there's actually barriers to having a national level system. However, with a common assessment, what you'll have is a reduction of these barriers, and economies of scale will be unleashed, whereby you'll be able to develop a product in Idaho, sell it in Philadelphia, and sell it in California. And this is actually a conscious thing that people are pushing for. As this quote on the board is from the former Chief of Staff to the Secretary of Education in the United States. And what she is saying here is that one of the goals of allowing for state curriculum, if you believe in a market ideology, you believe the best ideas will rise to the top. So if you set up a national market, you're going to allow entrepreneurship to be unlocked, where ideas will be scaled up. So this is actually a way that the market is being structured to allow certain economies of scale to be unlocked and certain schooling models to be unlocked that might be able to function at a national level. Importantly, we also have to think about how these changes are linked to broader changes in society. So most charter schools in the United States are responsible for creating their own brick and mortar buildings, and this is an expensive proposition. And for this reason, a lot of charter schools have gone out on the municipal bond market. By 2012, we're talking about $6 billion in bonds issued for the development of charter schools. And when you're going out and issuing a bond, you have to appear attractive to investors. And one of the things investors look at is numbers. And as this report by Balbani and Berry look at, when people are going out there and they're issuing these bonds, they're releasing pro formas that include their enrollment and also their standardized test scores. So if you're thinking about how different actors in a market are advantaged by connection to powerful interests and moneyed interests, you have to think about what are they going to see as good investment, who's going to be able to get money at a cheap rate, who's going to be able to get a lot of money to allow them to set up how they're going to compete on the market. So markets don't just naturally emerge in schooling when the state steps back by allowing charter schools, because there are all these conceptions of control, such as how standardized assessments will affect how markets emerge, how are charter school operators linked to money, and what type of things are moneyed interests looking for, that are going to really shape how markets are emerging in education. Another area I think is interesting to look at is at the state level. We've seen an emergence of online schooling and virtual charter schools. And these are very interesting to look at from a market-making perspective, because this is a new market that's emerging, and it's a highly controversial market. And it's varied strongly from state to state how these markets are emerging. And we can clearly see these markets' emergence as social by paying attention to the actors that are existing within them. So currently, this sector is almost completely dominated by two large national-level for-profit companies. K-12 Inc. and Pearson Education have their Connections Academy. And they're working very closely to lobby state legislatures to set up markets in education in a way that will advantage their particular brand of schooling. So these organizations like to set up in rural districts, but enroll students at a statewide level. They like to reduce requirements for in-state teaching, so they can have teachers wherever teach multiple courses. And they push legislators in various states to adopt these type of measures that will privilege their way of providing schools. At the same time, we're seeing strong lobbying by existing institutions such as teachers' unions, urban districts that are losing kids to these rural districts, that are pushing for a different way for these markets to be structured that will allow them to be more advantaged on this market. So we've seen school districts, online school districts created by states. In Oregon, actors associated with the teachers union have created their own virtual charter school that's unionized and works more closely with districts. And what we've seen here is also lobbying, fighting over how state legislation is going to emerge. And it's led to an amazingly variegated landscape of these type of markets where it's almost a running state-by-state battle where people are fighting about how this market will emerge. So in places like Arizona, you've seen legislation that really allows for these national level actors to benefit, where in Massachusetts, you're seeing a very tight control over how this market is emerging. And there have been various hybrids. And this becomes a very interesting scalar and geographic question because these actors are actually present in almost every state. You're seeing K-12 and Pearson active in every state and teachers unions. But how do we understand this vastly different emergence in these markets? And I would argue we have to pay attention to how they articulate with the local politics, with the different cultural projects that are going on in each of these states. And as such, we have to pay attention to how markets are embedded within different social institutions. How am I doing for time?
Just about 5 more minutes.
Okay, so I'll speed through this last one pretty quickly. At the municipal level, one of the key trends we've seen in the United States is the bypassing of school boards and the concentration of power with one person, often an unelected technocrat. This has happened in different ways. In places like Compton and Philadelphia and Detroit, we've seen the state actually step in and take over the school board. And then in places like Washington and New York and Chicago, although this was a while ago, the mayor is in charge of the school board and actually appoints one person to be in charge of the school. And often these people are appointed either come from outside of education or they're strong believers in the market ideology. And they strongly shape the systems, the institutions they're in charge of in order to promote these markets. And we have to think about how these institutional environments shape markets because they're not stable. A different mayor can get elected, different people can be appointed to a state board, to a municipal district of education that are going to allow for different things to happen on the market. So I think this is one of the things that explains what happened most recently in New York, where Mayor de Blasio said, we're not going to allow all of the charters that are proposed to come through, just a few of them. And what we saw was a huge influx of money saying, no, you have to allow them all. Huge ad campaigns, and ultimately he recanted upon his proposal. In Bridgeport, Connecticut, we saw something very similar where the Working Families Party elected a few people to the school board who were more critical of charter schools and market processes. Initially, the state attempted to take over that school board. That was deemed illegal. Then there was a mayoral referendum to concentrate power on the mayor. They lost that referendum, but what we saw there was a strong impetus to control the institutions that are gatekeepers to markets. Who are the people that are authorizing different charters? Who are the people that are looking at the accountability of different charters? And who is renewing them? Who is investigating corruption? And we've seen how this can greatly shape how markets emerge, whether for-profit actors dominate or whether non-profit actors dominate. And I think it's also important to think about the temporal politics and the temporal ways that markets are emerging, because the way these institutions are struggled over time is also going to shape how markets emerge. So we can't think of them as a system being marketized and staying stable in that marketized state, because this is going to change as markets are contested and markets are struggled over. So returning to my final slide, I think I'm okay for time actually. What I want to talk about is we can't understand markets markets and marketization as a complete concept. When we think about markets and marketization, we have to place it within the broader socioeconomic changes that are happening around it and the scalar and temporal politics that are shaping how markets are emerging as they're contested over by particular people. And one of the things I'm really interested in, maybe we can talk a bit about, I spent some time on my proposal on it, but I couldn't talk for an hour. That would have been very mean, but is how we can understand education better through understanding marketization. Because if education is relatively autonomous from the needs of capital, and markets are things that change as they interact with different logics as social institutions, how can we understand the logics of education better through understanding how it's impacting the way markets are forming in education? And particularly, is relative autonomy something that's being changed right now? Is it something that's likely to alter? Is it something that might no longer exist through the promotion of markets in education? So this is another area that I think could be interesting to look at through this approach. That's really all I have to say. Thank you for listening to me.